Hello, friends. This is Adrian Sinclair with a podcast with interesting people. And today my guest is Anoop Kumar, a medical doctor who wrote a book, Is This a Dream? He is a board-certified emergency physician practicing in Washington, D.C., and he also holds a master's degree in management with a focus in health relationship. But we're going to be talking about today about consciousness, about a lot of philosophical questions, about reality, the nature of reality, about ego, and about if we are living in a dream. Is this, Anoop, is this a matrix that we're in?
It's the reflection that we're all kind of entangled in, and that's why I wrote the book, is to reflect on that, not so much to answer it, but kind of each of us kind of walk that path and figure it out.
Yeah. I'm so excited to have you on the show because you are a very interesting person for sure, but also because you bring in sort of the scientific side. You have a classical medical training. You're an emergency physician, right? And then at the same time, you write this book, which is very eye-opening, very well written. I loved it. It really spoke to me, and you're combining these two things, which is like philosophy or more like a outlook on life, what it may be. And you also talk about consciousness and ego, and those are like ephemeral things. Like we really don't even know what consciousness is from a scientific perspective, and yet you tackle that while being a science man yourself. How did you come about doing that?
Consciousness is, as a kind of a formal topic, was something that I was introduced to pretty early in life, I think around late elementary school or something like that. My family was into philosophy, and we used to go to the local Chinmaya mission. It's an organization that talks about Vedanta, which is the ancient philosophy of India.
Right.
And basically that centers around these questions of what is mind, what is consciousness, what is identity, what is the world, what are the relationships among these, and what is the relevance of that to me leading a fulfilling life. So all of these things were kind of formally introduced to me at a young age. I think all children rather, engage with these questions very early. But for the most part, kids aren't given a framework for that.
Right.
We don't think about them as formal questions. We don't formalize them intellectually as children. But I think with every glance, with every exploration, every form of play, that's what we're doing, is we're inquiring into what the heck is going on here. Like, what is this like thing that I'm holding in my hands, except, eye and hand has not been formalized, so it's this kind of gentle, open, and even raw experience that later we get frameworks for. The more open and broad and versatile and flexible the frames, I better off children will be, because I don't think you can really contain whatever this is inside a framework, So I was lucky, I think, in being given that framework so that my life didn't have to be, squeezed in a vice, which I think can happen if you're not given a framework, and the first frameworks you're from school. And so that's how I guess that exploration happened, of reconciling these frameworks and these ideas, these stories, with what's actually happening here.
Right. It's very difficult to talk about consciousness in terms of science, because even though we have huge advancements in brain technologies, brain scanning, and brain understanding, we still we have some ideas, but those are just speculations and theories right now. Like, is that consciousness living in in a specific part of the brain, or is it the totality of? Is it your whole body? How conscious is everything? Consciousness. You have that idea as well, right? And but in your book you have a little bit different approach that you bring. So can you tell me, what is consciousness to you? How do you reconcile consciousness with like the science approach for consciousness and the consciousness that you talk about in the book?
Yeah. Well, consciousness in our society generally is not dealt with in a formal way. It's changing now. I think neuroscience is catching on that this is something important, and we now have theories about it. We have experiments involving it. However, generally speaking, it's not something that's talked about when you're growing up as a kid. It's not talked about, in school, it's not talked about. So, what happens is you end up having like 5 or 10 different ideas about what consciousness might be. And I think that's a good thing, because I don't think we can actually say what consciousness is, right? Consciousness is required to say what consciousness is, right? To not make it sound abstract, but anything you do or say or experience or whatever, the prerequisite for that is consciousness, obviously. So, to take a modification of that, to take a story about consciousness and expect that to be able to exactly elucidate consciousness, that's silliness. So what we have to do is tell better and better and better stories about it, right? Better descriptions, better experiments, etc. And thus, allow our minds to drop all the misconceptions. That's really the key. It's not about understanding it. It's about dropping all the misconceptions about what we think it might be. And one by one, as those walls come down, what it is, if it is even an it, starts to become more. So, for example, in science, if you say consciousness, in medical science, it's about how responsive you are. So we have levels in medicine. For example, there's you're awake and alert, or you can be somnolent, right? Where you're kind of like sleepy, not sleepy, in between. Then you can have lethargy, you can have obtundation, stupor, coma. These are all kind of levels of consciousness, right? So that's one way to categorize it. Then there's states. There are different kinds of states. For example, we are awake now, right? We're in like the waking state of consciousness. Then there's the dream state. Then there's the sleeping state where there's no projection. There's no projection of a waking experience nor of a dreaming experience. Then there's a daydreaming state in which you have 2 superimposed identities. One is taking predominance, but there's another one lurking in the background, and then you can switch identities. So there are all these different ways to categorize consciousness. I think it's really important to notice that, first of all. Number one, let's notice that there are 10 different ways to talk about this at least, right? There's also the consciousness of my own identity, for example. So once we see all this, then I think the next step is being like, okay, consciousness is not all these things. So what these things are modifications of consciousness. Like we said before, states of consciousness, or types of, or categories of consciousness. And then what I use for that is I use the word mind. And this is also what Vedanta uses, the philosophy of ancient India. It says that all of these are oscillations of consciousness, or forms of, the usual metaphor is like, let's say like the wind is a form of air, right? It's a kind of air, and you can have like high winds, low, gentle breeze, all these kinds of winds, but air is air. So similarly, you have these stations of consciousness that we call states of mind. But what consciousness is then, now you can see even process, now a little bit of clarity comes, right? We're like, okay. So all of these kinds of experiences are maybe like the dance or like the stage on which consciousness plays. And I think once a person kind of settles into that, then there can be a door opening up into what is actually behind this that is kind of appearing as all this. So that's what I would use the consciousness for, understanding that this is an extremely limited word. Consciousness it's more used because it's so intimate to us. And so if it's so intimate, and if I can follow that trail, it's like Hansel and Gretel's breadcrumbs to get back home. If I can follow that trail of my consciousness, like, where will it lead? That will be consciousness, wherever that leads.
I love your analogy. It really paints the picture of like how consciousness can be like considered like air and wind, because there's just so many different forms of it, and looking at from different perspective, you can kind of it's like like that old adage about a couple blind men touching a different part of the elephant, and everyone is describing it differently, but they are still touching one entity. Yeah, exactly. So tell me about how, so this is your second book. The first one is about body and anatomy, and how, we can think about it differently, but that's a topic for a different podcast. This one over here, is this all a dream that we're in? I mean, is the book is titled "Is This a Dream? Reflections on the Awakening Mind." By the way, forwarded by Deepak Chopra, which really eloquently kind of gave summary to your book, which I really enjoyed, and he kind of framed it in larger context as well, which I loved reading. So are we in a dream? What are we in? Are we in the Matrix? Everybody has that question when they saw the Matrix, and it was like, are we in some kind of grand simulation?
Yeah. Well, I think if we look at our experience, we see that we are many different people and many different characters at different times. So even if you look at a 24-hour span, the radical changes you experience, Adrian, all the listeners, myself, the radical changes we experience, I think we don't pay enough attention to. It is absolutely radical to drop your identity completely, drop any awareness of your body completely. The healthiest person on earth or the sickest person, whether you're the richest person alive or you have not a cent to your name, you drop it all every night.
Every night.
And you might pick a completely different character. A new body, a new personality, new wealth, new health, new relationships, who knows? And then we call that dream, of course. We call that dream sitting here in the waking place, looking at the other house and calling it something. But if you're in that house, they don't call it a dream. In the dream, nobody calls it a dream. We say this is real, right? And if they knew about something called waking, they'd be like, yeah, that's a dream over there.
Right.
So that reality is relative. So we drop our identities at the drop of a hat and take a new one at the drop of a hat. No qualms about it. We even drop all of it completely and go into what feels like oblivion in deep sleep. Perfectly content to not be anybody, not be anything, not have any experience apparently. Right?
Right.
So if we just look at that in 24 hours, how radically our experiences, then I think that should give us a hint as to what might actually happening here, right? Because all of the things that we call physical right now also appear very physical when we're in a dream. In the dream is absolutely physical. And if I drop a hammer on my toe, it will hurt, it'll bleed. I'll have to go maybe get it repaired if there's a fracture, whatever it might be, right? That happens in a dream. And when the state of mind shifts, the exact same thing that we knew for absolutely certain to be physical, now we know generally that it is mental. Right. And not only that, all the scientists within the dream, with the best degrees, the sharpest minds, will absolutely conclude that the things in the dream are physical, and they will be right. That's the key thing to understand. They will be right from of that state of consciousness.
Right.
But when that state shifts, then the very definitions that we're using change, right? It's a place that almost language can't go because our definitions are changing. Our fundamental experience of what's happening is changing. So to try to argue about it with words, without allowing the mind to go there, you just kind of run in circles.
This is so interesting. To the brain, when dream is happening, it's reality. It has no, I mean, just the input set is different, right? You're not getting stimulus from the outside. You don't have eyes open, so you're not taking in this reality that we think is reality. But to the brain, it's still real because it's the impulses are still coming in. It's still processing. You're still you're living in there, right? Whether you have lucid dream or not lucid dream, but you like you said, you might have a different identity. You might become a different person, or you're dreaming. It's really bizarre. So it's almost like maybe Matrix is not enough. Maybe a better analogy would be that movie Inception, in which you have dream within a dream within a dream within a dream. Yeah. And then when you roll back, so the big question is, who's dreaming it all? Is it God? Is it the consciousness? So, different people have different names for it. The universe, consciousness, presence, the awareness, the God for some, and that's kind of like the concept. Just label. For something that we can't describe because we can't even, our brains can't really define it. And it's like, self-licking ice cream account. You can't it's a contradiction. So So do you think that at the end, like the first dreamer is the awareness that has within which all these other dreams are happening, our reality, a dream, and then inside of our dreams there's another dream, and so on. What do you think about that? Is that what you kind of think is happening?
Yeah, in my view, there's no first dreamer. I think there are multiple experiences happening, multiple, let's say, frames of experience happening, and there's no real first in there. This is kind of like a cyclical thing. It's goal that you can't really pinpoint a beginning in a circle. We can arbitrarily designate a point as a beginning, but then it's arbitrary, and you can't say that's first, because then if that's first, then what are the preceding conditions for that? It's the same thing that we come across for the Big Bang.
Right.
You can't say, we're not allowed to say what's before the Big Bang, because the Big Bang itself was not in time, but time was created subsequent to that. So similarly, in terms of the observer, or what is the intelligence that is observing this, or what is the awareness, or what is the brain, if we want to call it a brain, what is that function or thing or whatever it might be that is the observer, that cannot be in time.
Right. No,
So,
and that's a valid observation, and I'm glad that you brought it up, because time is such a human dimension, right? It's and we know that even time, which we think as this constant clock that kind of measures out our life, even that is not real in terms of its frequency. I mean, it's in cyclical or measurement. Like, we know that time can dilate. We know time can speed up. It can compress. That's scientifically proven. So it also can be infinite, and it can be none. It can be no time. So therefore, it is very, three-dimensional or four-dimensional for us to think in terms of like, oh, it's just the three dimensions that we can see, and the fourth dimension being time, and that's everything that's in existence. But necessarily, there is edge cases in which there is no time, and maybe all the time, the infinite, and so yeah, I like that, because then that kind of deals with the issue of like, who is that first mover, who is that first dreamer, because it wouldn't have beginning. It's almost like it always had to exist. It always had to be in order for everything else to actually occur.
Yeah, and I think that question of who is the first or what is the first comes in time, comes with linearity. It comes from this subject-object split. Right? When there's me and I'm looking else, and there's this kind of dichotomy, there's a study here, then that is what allows for space and time, right? You need 2 points to define space. A single point cannot define space. So the first 2 points are my identity and your identity, or I am here and everything else is not here. It's what we call there. And these 2 mental points of here and there are the axis around which space and time are framed. And so this question of what is time, or where does time come from, as long as that split is there between myself and what I'm looking at, that split of now and then, or that split of now and later, then there's always going to be one before and one before and one before. And that's why we always have the tendency to ask what is before the Big Bang, because we're asking as if we are here and the Big Bang is something else, and now I want to go further back in that progression. But really, I think the answer to that is to see, what are these 2 points? What is the nature of these 2 points? What is the origin of these 2 points, right? Not what is before this point, right? Because before this point is this point. Before this point is this point. And then,
right.
It's endless. It's an endless regression. But if I just say, look, let me stop trying to go backwards and backwards. Let me just look at the 2 points I have right now, no matter where they are. Are they further down? Are they before, whatever it may be? Let me pick any 2 points and now inquire into what is the nature of these 2 points. From what do these 2 points arise, right? And that is kind of a meditation unto itself. And the answer to that is outside of time, because now you are forced to reconcile any apparent dualities, any apparent multiplicities, right? And that might sound abstract. What it really means is, ultimately, we have to meditate on our own identity, because anything that we perceive, anything we think of, whether it's a thought or an emotion or something that seems apparently external and physical and discrete, like an object out there, it can only be perceived in relation to our identity. If there's no identity, there's no perception. An ultimate point, the point of points, so to speak, is the sense of identity. If that is meditated on, that's why the great traditions say go within or know thyself, right? It's highly scientific, actually, because to know oneself is to understand the nature of space and time and where and how this originates. Because the initial point for any human being ever who has experienced space has to be their sense of localized identity. If your identity is not localized, you cannot experience space nor time. And we know that because where does space and time go when we sleep, right? It disappears. So by recognizing the nature of the identity, that's where the answer is as to what is the so-called first mover, but it's not really the first mover. It's simply that which appears as movement, that which appears as all movers.
So,
and that is where the mind, that polarity is integrated and it stills.
So when we sleep, we our identity may dissolve and become something else, whatever our brain is doing, and maybe reliving or tapping into something. I don't know. I believe that space and everything else still exists in our kind of human definition, right? You can still roll off your bed and fall to the ground while sleeping, right? And so that still is there. But our identities definitely kind of go away, right? You can or can at least, especially when you're dreaming, you can like, hey, I thought I was this or that, and how odd that is, right? And that's kind of like what you start the book with, which is really interesting. How you kind of describe a little story, how someone, hey, you're not really who you are, you're really not who you think you are, and so you start off with identity, and identity is such a interesting topic because it's that box within which we live. It's that set of definitions that tell the world who we are. And you start off with a story where, when baby is born, and even before it's born, it doesn't have any identity yet. It already lives, right? And so is identity as the component in your book, or like the first chapter, is that derived from the philosophy of I hope I want to pronounce this properly. Is it Vedanta?
Vedanta, yeah.
Vedanta. So is that like a critical component in Vedanta? Does it start with identity over there as well?
Yeah. Let me come back to that. I just want to touch briefly on what you mentioned about sleep and space. So like you said, yes, just because I'm not experiencing space, it doesn't mean space disappears completely. However, the integration of the 2 points of the subjectivity in sleep is not a complete integration, because what happens in sleep is that mind is not able to integrate it completely. And so it kind of gives up and it lets go. And so everything goes dark essentially, and there's no experience. So sleep is not a complete integration. So a complete integration means that is integrated through sleep, and that is present even through the waking state, in the waking state now. So that is when the nature of space is actually understood. So it's not that, we don't actually understand anything in sleep, right? All we know is that our experience of space goes away. But as you said, very importantly, it doesn't mean the world disappears for other people.
Right.
So my space is different from other people's space in the sense of that subjective experience of space. But to go beyond the individual experience of space means that individual identity has to be more completely integrated. And that is not only dreams, but also waking. And so that in Vedanta is called state, even though it's not really a fourth, it's actually the state that's already here. But that is the state in which it's completely integrated, in which the understanding of space actually from this kind of personal view, or what we call a third person view, or what we call an objective or more precise intersubjective view in terms of agreement among many people. So I just want to clarify that one point. In terms of identity is just like the central cog. It's just, I wish there were a class in, I don't know, kindergarten, or probably don't need it, probably elementary school sometime, about identity, just simple stuff about identity, because it literally is at the heart of everything we do. The reason people argue, identity, right? They let go of what they are. The reason people agree is because of identity. The reason people think they are who they are, feel they are who they are, expand, contract, move, grow beards, whatever it might be, it's all identity. Identity shifts so much. So it's at the core. So of course, I would
or
say
laziness
that
in
is
terms
at the
in,
core.
or laziness if it's in with respect to a beard.
Right, but then there still has to be that identity that doesn't feel like shaving, right? I know,
That's
I'm
true.
right there too, right? So without that identity, there's nothing happening. So yes, it is at the core of Vedanta, of course. It ultimately has to be at the core of any philosophy, because if you're not dealing with identity, you're kind of, and I think everything is kind of gradually getting there at different points. Vedanta starts at many different points. It doesn't necessarily start with the core question. Many times it's presented in the form of like a Q&A of like a student asking a teacher. That's how like some of the literature is written.
Mm-hmm.
So a student will say, God, I'm so frustrated and like this sucks. I'm fed up with this and like I've done this, not this, but I don't know. I'm just angsty. I'm just restless and I don't know what to do. And the teacher just sits there, doesn't say anything, and it drives the student even more crazy. Like, why do you look so relaxed? Or why do you seem fine? Need money? You don't have this. You don't have why yourself. So it starts very practically. I mean, this is something everybody can relate to, right? Anybody who's in this kind of phase relates to this.
Right.
And so it's it doesn't start off with you, but when the student is ready, then the book goes there and it takes kind of a dramatic turn. And at some point, the student is faced with, I thought this, and this, but now look here. Is this really what it seems? And that's when it starts to change. When that moment comes, somebody says, are things how I thought they were? And if not, what is that road? What is that road I want to take? And first of all, seeing that fork in the road is a huge moment in that person. And then secondly, when they start to walk that road, it's a new life. It's kind of like a different life. And the ability to integrate the two, I think, is what's really important in this time, in this day and age in our society, integrating that and not necessarily leaving the old life behind per se, at least some of the things that need to be done. That's really key.
I really subscribe to a lot of stuff that you said. Well, actually, probably all of it. I just need to digest all of it because I was reading your book, and even late last night, I was taking that. I'm like, oh my gosh, this just feels so right. But the comment that I wanted to make is about identity and what you just said. A lot of our issues, individually and on this planet, are stemming from identity. Like you said, we argue, we fight. There's wars. There's a lot of that is just at the core of that is identity. In your tribe, and it's various abstraction layers of that tribe. Oh, it's my group, it's my religion, it's my nation, it's my this, it's my region. All of those different identities are separating us from sort of like the oneness. And I like what you say in the book when you get into the point of talking about love, and when you remove the sort of the identity and consider consciousness spread out all over, and that awareness being everything, and you're seeing love when you're seeing someone else, and that identity peels off. You see that you're one, you're connected. We are connected on so many different levels, even like on like physical level, like in physics. I mean, we have atoms. We're this soup of atoms over here, coherent in sort of like a spot. But, there's no like clear separation. There's still air. Even in vacuum, there's still other, we learn about these subatomic particles. They appear from anywhere, from nowhere. They disappear. Like everything is still connected. So if you have that kind of mindset that everything is sort of like living in this soup, and some analogies that you use, I think, was like the ocean, and you're just a ripple on top of the the surface layer, but everything down below is still connected. It's so deeply connected. And I think if you shift your perspective, and that's why I think your book is so valuable, because it does a really good job at showing that and kind of illuminating that different perspective, then people will see, oh my gosh, like, how can I be mad at you or fight with you or do all unthinkable things to you if you consider that everything is part of that oneness? It's kind of like one arm trying to fight with the other arm. It's connected to the same body, right? And if you have that realization, I think if more people would have that realization and they would truly live it, we would have love, and we wouldn't have wars. We wouldn't have that, because you would have that totally different perspective. perspective. And I think because of that identity, that's you're like, oh, me, it's me. I'm just here. This is, I need to protect this. That's where fear starts and everything else. And so that alone in your book is just so eye-opening that, I hope as many people can read this as possible to kind of change their perspective and mind shift.
Yeah, and you said that beautifully. The thing about this is, I don't really see this so much as necessarily a spiritual thing. I think a lot of times this stuff gets put into spirituality. I wonder if it's on the book somewhere. I don't know. But anyway, it's often like this kind of stuff is called spirituality, but I think it's the most practical thing in the world. I mean, I don't think they're necessarily spiritual about seeing what's happening clearly. I mean, I don't know that that's spiritual. I guess we could call it spiritual. I think that's practical. Seeing what's happening comprehensively, more completely, understanding. I mean, I don't, is that spiritual? I don't know. I think that's common sense. I mean, that's what everybody wants. Yeah. I mean, is there anybody who doesn't want to see clearly?
Right.
I mean, unless to protect their identity. Yes, to protect a person, they might not want to see clearly, right? But if they could see how not to be afraid, how to feel better, how not to be scared of these different things, and if they could experience what that feels like, nobody would go back. Nobody would go back. So, I'm also careful about using this word spirituality because I think it gives an idea that there's something else or something different. This conversation to me, I had somebody recently, and I was saying, like, for example, I have a laptop in front of me, right? The fact that there's a laptop in front of me right now is not spiritual. It's very practical. There's a laptop. I'm using it to have this conversation, etc. And the reason it's not spiritual, we don't call it spiritual, is because everybody agrees, yes, there's a laptop in front of you and there's a function for it and we're using it. When every perception hasn't necessarily opened up and when they're not aware of everything that's happening, then some small sliver experience, we got to call it something. So we call it strange, or we call it mystical, or we call it spiritual or esoteric. We make up these words instead of just saying, there's some things I don't know, let me just find out. Almost like if you have a room in your house and you're like, I've never been to that room, let me go open the door and find out. We wouldn't call it a spiritual room, right? We wouldn't call it a mystical room. We just be like, yeah, there's a space there that I haven't been to. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the way we have to start looking at. Like, there's more happening that meets the eye. Okay, let me find out where those doors are in my mind and try to open them and see.
So, and we have different tools to do that, right? Some people, science is definitely one methodology to do that. We dissect things. We look under a microscope. We run experiments. We see if we can repeat those experiments. We have the scientific method. But then there's things that are either impossible to examine or impossible to define. If you talk about, let's say, to some, you have Dao De Ching, which is talking about the Dao, and that which can be named the Dao is not the Dao itself, because that's just, and that's why, like, that's why poetry is so great, because it can almost touch the untouchable, the things that we can't define, because if you can define it, then it's not it, because it's more than that. And that just kind of reflects on the limitations of even our existence, our perceptions. We realize through science that there's more out there than we can see. I mean, we can't see infrared, we can't see ultraviolet, we can't see gamma rays. We have instruments that help us with that. But even with that, we're kind of handicapped because we're getting down to like the quantum physics and where stuff is just really bizarre and we really don't have explanations. And one thing that I see that's happening sort of in the science as I'm kind of reading different things and talking to different people is there is sort of like slow confluence of science and the unknown. I don't know, we can call it spirituality or something else, where we realize that we don't know some things, and worse, science can say we will never be able to say some things or test certain things just because of these limitations. But it's interesting to kind of see how things are kind of getting closer together. They are intersecting, and even science are saying, like, look, we just don't know, and I don't think we will be ever be able to know. And I think that's a very soothing feeling, at least for me, because it brings those two domains closer. Before it was like science, religion here. Religion here, or faith or spirituality here, and then science here, and they never talked because there's like this barrier. But now they're getting closer, and stuff that you describe in the book is talking about that as well, and in such a way that it's you don't leave with like a sense of conflict of like not like you still have like, oh, okay, I guess I can reconcile those two and be okay with it, and I think that's a great place to be, and gosh, and I was going to leading into a question, but but I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts
comment on that?
Yeah, comment on that, please. I was going to say, like, what do you see, like, in that space, like science and the other side?
Well, of course, there's no conflict because it's the human being doing both. I mean, it's a human being doing whatever's called spiritual. It's a human being doing whatever's called science, right? And not only is it the human being, it's a sense of identity of who and what I am that is conducting this. And they're using the exact same tools, which is thought, emotion, desire, memory, perception, the externally directed sense organs, the eyes, the nose, the tongue, right? Mm-hmm. It's the exact same tools that all of us are using to do anything, to do good stuff, to do bad stuff, to do spirituality, to do religion, to do science, to do philosophy, right? It's not like somebody has some special tool. And it's not like one category of research has an extra tool. No, we're using the exact same tools, but depending on what frame of experiences we're looking at, we might call it science or spirituality, right? Meditation is a kind of science experiment. You have a hypothesis. You're like, oh, I see these people meditating, and it seems like when they do this happens to the mind. Okay, that's my hypothesis. Now, let me experiment. I did this. Oh no, this sucks actually. My mind is more active, right? It's the universal experience of the meditator. Right. Okay, that failed. Let me adjust my technique. Let me do this. Let me adjust this. Let me try this. Let me steady myself a little more. All these protocols are changed. Now, what are the outcomes? Oh, okay, eventually I do realize, oh, either my mind is getting steady or there's some new avenues opening up. Oh, okay. This is a protocol that has been practiced for thousands and thousands of years and verified thousands of times. Generally, it's not called science. Why? Because it's looking at the more subjective end of experience and not the intersubjective end, right? What we call the intersubjective end is objectivity. We say that when I see something out there, it's objective. It's truly there. What do we mean? We mean that all of us see it. Right. Or at least the people who are considered sane, who we like and we respect, they all see it and say it's there. That's what objectivity is in some way, right? In terms of objective thought or objective, an object in front of us, whatever it might be. It's more intersubjective, actually. Whereas meditation is more just one person, right? It's just subjective within myself. Now, it can be compared among many people, but generally other people are not privy to winning in my internal audience. So it's on the more subjective end. But the process are the same. The protocols are the same. The investigative tools are the same, right? But it's just the fidelity is hard to assess because it's within one person's experience. So that's one thing. The second thing is science has discovered so much, right? Just in medicine, I recently wrote a post about, penicillin and pacemakers, in vitro fertilization, all the stuff that we're doing in science. Science has advanced so much that really there's been no need to be like, hey, what else is going on? Because it's discovery after discovery after discovery after discovery. But now what's happening is science has discovered so much that it's reaching the ends of what can be understood within a subject-object split framework. So as long as I'm looking at something out there as independent of me, as if it's independent of me, and trying to understand it, I can understand a lot, but there is a barrier that will come up, and we're seeing it in quantum physics, in trying to understand the nature of the particle that I'm looking at that appears to be out there, that sometimes looks like a field, sometimes looks like sometimes it's classical, sometimes it's quantum, etc. I think we're seeing it in cosmology as well, and we're seeing it in neuroscience in terms of understanding consciousness. All of these problems will reach intractability until we learn that we cannot be separate from the problem that we're looking at. And then we start to look at these 2 points of me and that, of I and that, and try to integrate that. And then I think we will make some discoveries about the mind that will be literally mind-blowing, that we did not know before. And then we will make further progress. There is another entire horizon of progress to be made once we understand the nature of the subject-object split in cosmology, in quantum physics, in neuroscience, in all of these fields. And we will develop crazy technologies. Hopefully we will be responsible enough and mature enough to handle that appropriately.
You can't, and this is not in your book, as far as I can tell, you cannot omit the conversation about artificial intelligence and consciousness. So I'm going to take you on a little wild ride over here, as opposed to our sort of like biological or human consciousness or just universe-based consciousness. What are your thoughts on artificial intelligence? And, is it just a matter of complexity? Is it do you think that, machines or artificial intelligence is going to become conscious?
So, before we talk about artificial intelligence, we have to ask a question, natural intelligence. Right? We keep talking about artificial intelligence, as if we know what the opposite is. The opposite would, of course, be natural intelligence, and we consider ourselves, human beings and animals, maybe plants, to have natural intelligence, right? Like nature, life in itself. But again, what is that? We don't know, and this goes back to the first question we started with, which is, what is consciousness? We don't know what natural intelligence is. All we know is that we have it, and we're using it in some way. We know its manifestations. We know what it looks like. We know what it does, including coding AI. Natural intelligence codes for AI. We know that. Right. But what is it exactly? We don't know. And I think that's why there's all this confusion about AI. Some people say, no, robots won't be conscious. Some people say robots will be consciousness. My question is, what is consciousness? Answer that question first before we go off on these tangents, before we add layers of confusion to the confusion that's already there. Like thinking I'm smart and I know what I'm talking about, add 5 more layers of confusion, and then it's like, no, they will be conscious. No, they won't be conscious. And I don't know if we really know what we're talking about to begin with. In my view, like I said, this word consciousness is extremely limited. In Vedanta, the word for whatever it is that's here is called Brahman. And one description of that, and an approach to trying to describe that is called Satchidananda. Satchidananda is what we can say is kind of like the nature of Brahman. And this Satchidananda is made up of 3 words in Sanskrit, which is Sat, Chit, and Ananda. And Sat, and none of these have English translations really. A language is a language unto itself. Sat is something like existence / truth / reality. Chit is something like awareness / knowledge / consciousness. Ananda is something like limitlessness / bliss, right? So if we wanted to translate Satchidananda, it would be something like, let me see if I can do this. Awareness, reality, truth, consciousness, awareness, existence, limitlessness, bliss. I mean, it's almost mumbo jumbo. Absolutely abstract when you put it into English and try to understand what this is. But that is what at least they said, what this Vedantins said, that the nature of this thing is. Now, that is what we're trying to capture in this word consciousness.
Consciousness, right.
Consciousness, right? And now we're talking about artificial consciousness, which is what we mean, right?
Right.
So you can see like how far we've come from what the heck it is we're actually supposed to be trying to talk about. So in my view, whatever is here is what is modifying or differentiating as everything else, right? Just like the entire human being, bones, blood, hair, everything, the organs, everything comes from that single embryo, right? It's that first egg and sperm that meet. And from that zygote, it differentiates how many times into however many different kinds of cells, right? So similarly, it's this, whatever it is here, we can't really call it anything. Brahman is a Sanskrit word. It has no real direct translation. It apparently differentiates into this. And I say apparently because it only appears a certain way from a certain perspective. When I assume a certain identity, a certain kind of world is perceived. When that identity is shifted, a different kind of world is perceived. So this idea about an independent, external, objective world is mainly an idea. So as to artificial intelligence, I think this has to be understood first. And in my view, everything is of the nature of intelligence. I won't say everything has intelligence. I'm not saying there's some dead stuff called matter and there's some smart stuff called intelligence. I'm saying it is intelligence itself, which appears in different forms. Or you might say consciousness, or you might say mind, or you might say awareness, or you might say, if you're religious, you might say God. I don't know. I don't think the word really matters, and I think it's more distracting. But the recognition or the falling off of the walls of the mind such that it can be recognized that there is something here that is differentiating and appearing as this kind of perceived reality. When we see that, then the difference between AI and, I guess, NI, natural intelligence, I don't think there's such a thing, but I just made it up.
I just said, yeah, that's great. You heard it here, folks.
Yeah. The difference between AI and NI is actually a matter of recognition. It's a recognition of a level of intelligence. We're not saying that human beings have something that, the chair you're sitting on absolutely does not have, because the human being in the chair fundamentally is made of the same thing. It's not that the chair has intelligence, but the chair is of the nature of intelligence to begin with. But now the chair looks dumb. It's not speaking English. It's not sounding fancy. It's not doing all this fancy stuff. But if you look closely at the chair, you'll see an incredible tapestry of intelligent orchestration, right? The electrons dancing in the orbitals, the protons and neutrons, how they're held together. I mean, it's protons, neutrons, and electrons. Why isn't it a pineapple, right? Why doesn't the chair spontaneously reconfigure into the sky? It doesn't, because there are certain laws. There's an intelligence at play, right? So the difference between AI and NI is a matter of recognition. How far evolved is my own consciousness, my own ability to recognize what is happening? At some point, a person recognizes that even what we call things that are not alive are intelligence in a kind of state of flux. And so the difference between NI and AI is a matter of degree, but it appears so foreign to us because of the walls on our own mind, so we cannot recognize what's actually happening over there. And from a practical perspective, it can be, we have to make sure we understand that. We can't imagine, they're going to be conscious, and they're going to be conscious like us humans, and they're going to like us. And no, it's like that. We are using a fraction of our intelligence to create AI. A fraction of it. We don't really know what we're doing. We think we know what we're doing, but we're using just a fraction of our own natural intelligence, whatever part we can consciously access, which is usually pretty small, and we're using that fraction to code AI. That's how intelligent we are as human beings. Even that amount can do these amazing things, right? So that difference between AI and I call it a recognition problem. It's not actually a question of can it become conscious, can it not become consciousness, or can it not become conscious? My fundamental position is consciousness is fundamental. It is appearing as everything. Can I recognize it or not? And then can I if I recognize it, make sure I'm doing things in the right way at level to create an optimal society?
It's very interesting. Again, this goes back into identity, right? It goes back into what we want to put in a box. Like, this is artificial intelligence, this is natural intelligence. And we do that in part because as humans, we need to, it all kind of stems from like, how do we protect ourselves? Like, this is a tiger. I need to label that as a tiger, that's danger and what have you. And it kind of, we have that, in our genes, we have that kind of fear. If we just kind of think that we are just a thing that's our body, right? If we just think that this is it, then we have those fears because we want to obviously, protect ourselves and all of that. And then, so it naturally expands into, extrapolates into the AI, which is the fear, like, once AI is going to be conscious, are they going to be thinking about us? If they're going to be thinking about us in the same terms as we think about ourselves, then obviously fear is going to come in because self-preservation is going to kick in, and obviously, we got the Terminator movie that completes the rest of this story. We get wiped out. But if you shift the perspective in the way you said it, and you recognize that all of this is part of just manifestation of consciousness, then you would not feel separated even from such a thing as artificial intelligence, which we think like machines. So we think rigid bodies, we think not biological, right. We think all those different things, not like us, in other words, right?
Right.
Going back to what you said before, which is how science is limited because it can do objective, experiments and analysis of exploration of objective things, going in our minds and going in ourselves. What are some of the tools that you use to do that? I mean, you talk about meditation in your book, and you make some interesting points over there. But how are you exploring, in your life, in your experience, going inwards?
So I like to take walks. I like going outside in nature. I like spending time in nature. So I try to do that a few times a week. When I don't have something to do, like if I'm not having this conversation, then I just kind of relax. I let the identity go and relax. Like there's an idea in our society that you always have to do something.
Right.
It's this kind of insanity that we've developed in our society, that you always got to be doing something. And if you're not doing something, you're not valuable. And if you're not, doing something, then you're lazy. If you're not doing something, then you're stupid or you don't get it, or, it's an insanity we have in our society. So I've let that insanity go. So if I don't, and most people will recognize when the kind of thoughts that seem to circulate a lot, when they die down, there's actually not so much to do. It's because of the thought currents that might be going on and on that it feels like there's a lot, right? Just like if you go into a big empty room, just be like, oh, empty room. Okay. If you go into a room and then there's like an arcade here and there are kids running around here and there's somebody throwing a football here and somebody's doing math here, somebody's shaking you, asking you a question here, all of a sudden there's a lot to do. Well, just imagine that room is the mind. The personal mind, right? If the personal mind is filled with all of these thoughts, it seems like there's a lot to do, even if there really isn't much to do. It just seems like it because there's so much activity, and then the attention gets caught up in that, and then the sense of identity says it has to go this way or it has to go that way, right or left. I've got to make it go this way or that way, and you end up doing all this kind of stuff. But if those kind of thoughts die down and you're taking your cues from what's actually happening, from the things that are actually influencing your life and not just your own individual thoughts about what's happening in the life, then there's much less to do because, like I said, there is an intelligence that's already at play. Like we're not digesting our own food, right? We're not making our eyes work. I'm not making myself speak English now, right? I'm not making my blood circulate. I'm making my heart pump.
Right. Growing your hair.
The sun rise, right? I'm not making the moon. It's like these things are so obvious that 99.9% of what's happening is there is an intelligence at play, and we are a modification of that. And so if that kind of awareness can dawn, then like a lot of the thoughts, if not all, will just die unless you need them for something in particular.
Right.
And then you can use them as needed. And the rest of the time, you were asking about my case, I relax. I go in nature, or I do what I have to do. I pick up my son from school. I go to work.
Slow down the
relax,
thinking.
I would say.
What about meditation? How do you go about meditation? And if there's any tips or tricks that you can share in terms of how to make because to some meditation is stop thinking. To others, and I've heard different takes on this. Some people are like, no, it's not that I need to stop thinking. It's that I'm not fixated on thinking or stopping my thoughts, because then you're trying to like, oh, I'm not going to think. Oh, crap, I'm thinking about not thinking, and then you continue in that cycle. How do you meditate?
So meditation initially is a process that happens when a person is sitting, standing, walking, whatever they do, and they're shifting their attention to mind, right? People, I guess, might call it mindfulness. I'm not really sure about the differences about all these. I think there's too much made of the differences between mindfulness and meditation and all these kinds of things. Basically, get to know your mind is the idea, whatever way you do it. But you shift your attention to the mind and you recognize, holy crap, there's a lot of stuff happening here, right? There's like a whole kind of world that I've been avoiding.
Right.
And so you bring your attention to that world. Bringing your attention to that world is the beginning of meditation. All right. So you now feel the partition between what seems like an external world outside of you, and you feel like there's an internal world too, like within your head, within your abdomen, wherever it might be for you. There feels like there's some kind of internality. And bringing the attention now to the internal is the beginning. Now, keeping it there requires different amounts, depending on the person, of dedication, courage, time, like very high demands, right? Courage is not something that's easy. There's certain points when you come to meditation, there's certain things you don't want to see in your thoughts, memories that might come up, things you want to avoid. That's hard, right? That's courage. Right. When you sit down and you feel like everybody who sits down is peaceful, and that's how they talk about it in podcasts, that they get very peaceful and everything's good. And now you sit down and your mind's going crazy and you're like, this sucks. I'm the worst meditator ever. And nobody ever tells you that exactly is what happens in meditation, even for the great ones and the enlightened ones. That's the same thing that happens for them when they started. That can be daunting. Then it takes time. Like, when the whole world is telling you you're only valuable when you're making money, you're only valuable when you're doing something that other people can recognize as valuable, then 10 minutes is a lot of time. 10 minutes is extreme. So these are very costly to the beginning meditator, right? So that's why it can seem so difficult, but that's why I think these conversations are helpful. So bringing the attention to that mind, and having courage when needed, knowing that there are millions of people who have walked before you, whoever that is, who's meditating at that time and gone through the exact same things. And knowing that, frankly, there is something amazing on the other side of it. I feel like sometimes that's not, like nowadays, that's not said enough. It's like you're not supposed to say it but I think it's freaking amazing. Your world gets completely changed. Stuff you thought was impossible, stuff you knew was impossible is like your reality. And I think that's not said enough. I think we tend to downplay it into like it's peace. It's peace, but it's peace that's indescribable. It's not just peace. It's like the depths of the Pacific Ocean. Bloom, bloom, bloom. It's just like a throbbing peace, So
and on a practical level, on a practical level, how do you meditate in terms of like? I'll give you an example. I will focus on body awareness to kind of feel my body. That kind of calms me down, and it also focuses my mind onto whatever I'm thinking about, top of my head, my body parts, and then as that kind of relaxes, then I try to look at things. I don't necessarily have my eyes closed when I meditate, but I can look outside the window with beautiful view and then just not think anything about it. Just take it in without any of that internal monologue that happens. Oh, look, a lot of skies today. Maybe it's going to be raining or snowing. All of that commentary, which is that busy bee in our brains, which is constantly, analyzing and looking at everything. And then as that kind of, then you have that sweet spot, or at least I have that sweet spot where like nothing is happening. I'm here, I'm present, I'm just observing things and not commenting on it. And that's a kind of sense of peace, peaceful sensation that I have. And then of course there is, oh shit, I have to go and buy something. I need bananas for my daughter, and I need this and milk, and and your mind is just kicking in, and you're like, ooh, I noticed that. And then you start to kind of try to disconnect from that again and get back on track. So in a sense, and this is going back to sort of like talking about identity in your book, there's points in some of the meditation in which I realize that here's the ego, or here's the that personality that's observing these things, whatever's happening, and then there's almost like a witnessing presence that's behind it that actually sees that thing, which is in a way distressing, because then you're like, do I have split personality or something? What is happening here? How is it that I have like this different perspective? And for the record, I don't think I have split personality or any kind of issues of that nature. No, but on a serious note, it's just, it's fascinating because you have like, we have this idea of our consciousness as this one solid kind of thing. But like you said in your book and in this podcast, it's many different things, right? And so shifting in that meditation, I think meditation is a tool that allows you to notice that those different perspectives. Here's the ego. It cares about the world, the physicality of things, the self-preservation. Here's this witnessing thing that's seeing that ego, and there might be others too. Who knows? I haven't experienced that. But how does that happen to you when you meditate? What happens? How do you go about meditation on a practical level? And do you experience the same thing? Am I crazy, or do we all have that capability of seeing and witnessing and having that kind of shifts in different perspective as we meditate?
I think this witnessing idea is kind of maybe the main tool or the main configuration of the mind that's used in meditation. I mean, the idea that, that there is this kind of meta level of awareness that is observing what feels like a more local personality that's doing stuff, right? And so this configuration, that witnessing configuration, is like almost like universally, it seems like the meditative configuration of watching this. And so what's recognized is that there is these different levels of identity. And eventually that all integrates, right? At different points, that also integrates. So the idea, sometimes what I am is what's the witness, and the personality is kind of going along. Sometimes, like you said, I have to get this, I have to do this. Then it goes to the individual. But even these tools ultimately have to integrate that witness. And that comes from remaining and getting comfortable with that witness, right? And then these two start to not be so different. So in terms of the process, it's simply relaxing. Like if there's the local personality here, it's first of all relaxing awareness. So it kind of just relaxes a little bit, right? And then what happens is it gets constrained over here. Like I am only the witness, and all this is not real. The world is not real, so to speak, which Vedanta says Vedanta actually doesn't say that. It just says that the world is false, in the sense that the world is not what it appears to be, is what it says. But sometimes in the witness state, you'll hear that the world is not real. Why? Because the identity has now shifted to this. And now all of this kind of seems like dreamlike.
Right. Yes,
the
exactly.
Objects, even your own body and your personality, all this kind of seems like kind of dreamish and dreamlike. And then eventually this has to integrate too. We can't say this is real and that's not real, and still comes some kind of split in the mind, right? This idea of something is real and something is unreal, that itself has to be integrated. Like these words in and of themselves have no real meaning. They have no meaning, like real, unreal. I mean, it's only when the mind is divided that it can kind of these things, that there's something that's real, there's something that's unreal, and because we have certain criteria for what is real and unreal. Right. So after this configuration exists for a while, then these two get integrated. And these two are those points about here, there, or me, you, or the duality, the space, etc. And so these two also have to be integrated. So then meditation, I would say at that point, it's not really a meditation anymore. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I mean, but it's more that the mind is kind of meditative. And the mind can do what it wants. The mind can still experience emotions. It might not experience them like it did, but it may. The mind may stay very quiet for some people. For some people, the mind may be very active. But the point is, it doesn't remain in that kind of polar configuration anymore. So instead of meditation as a distinct activity, it becomes like a meditativeness. And as needed, the kind of local equipments can be taken up and functioned through. And when that's not needed, then it's a relaxation into like that integrated, whatever it is that is appearing as this.
With respect to meditation, it almost like it's a mechanism, it's a tool to allow you to not only relax, and because mainly when people think of meditation, it's like, oh, dude, you just need to chill. You need to meditate a little bit more, But I think it's also a tool to allow us to do that inner exploration that you mentioned, which is which helps you see different perspectives, and even that witnessing awareness and all of that. Especially in the context when I was reading your book about identity, and this is what I loved about your book. It's when you talk about what happens when we're going to sleep. We're okay with going to sleep and losing our identity, and if we could have the same kind of feeling about eventually we're all going to die, and if you treat it the same way as if you're just going to go into this dream state and go back into this other aspect. It's really, there's like such clear parallels. It blows my mind that I never thought about that in such a way, because we're so okay with going to sleep. In fact, we're looking forward to going to sleep. Sometimes we want I wonder what I'm going to be dreaming about. And so if you have the same perspective about even like your life and dying, then your relationship with death, it would be totally different. It would be okay, You're not afraid. You're not afraid when you go to dream, and unless you have some kind of horrors or something that you're processing, and then you're like, I want to wake up from that.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts on that when death and dreams, and how does that factor in your life?
The reason that we are afraid of death is because when we come into the world, the people around us are afraid of death. But when we come into this world, the people around us are not afraid of sleep. And that's like the fundamental difference. It's this kind of training. Like kids aren't afraid to go to sleep, right? But all of the adults, everything you hear about death, like everybody's wearing black, everybody's quiet, everybody's crying, everybody's, So I think that's the main difference, actually. And of course, why are adults like that? It's because there's no memory. Today is... What is today? Today's Thursday, right? So if I had no memory of Wednesday, if all of us woke up and we had complete amnesia of the previous day, we wouldn't believe that we were there. We'd just be like, I started today. We would have a different word for it. We'd just be like, oh, yeah, we started today. I started today. And no idea what was before that, right?
Right.
And then I might be totally afraid of when I'm starting to get sleepy, or when something's happening, I don't know what's going to come next, right? Because there's no framework for it. So similarly, if we don't remember what happened, or there's no definition of what happened before we came into this lifetime, then all of a sudden it's like when the end of this lifetime comes, it's like I'm gonna do it like in a puff of smoke. Everything about me is just gonna disappear. Why? It's simply because there's no memory. It's and we haven't been given the frameworks. And if you are given the framework, it's something called reincarnation, or it sounds very fancy or like mystical or cultish or religious, right? Like Wednesday is not a cult. Wednesday was yesterday. Friday's not a cult. Friday's tomorrow. It's a silliness. So it's a matter of just expanding works, expanding our perception a little bit. And if you can see yesterday, if you can see a little bit of tomorrow, you go to sleep. You go to sleep. You might still, like if I get a new toy and I'm really playing with it, I not want to sleep. I don't want to sleep. I might even fight my sleep because I really like this toy and I really want to play with it as long as possible. I don't want to, and I end up even sleeping with it. So when I wake up, I have the toy again in my hand, right? So similarly, if somebody might still really like this, the people around them or what's happening this life, they don't want to let go. And then, when they wake up again in a new lifetime, well, again, might be similar circumstances happening. So those things can happen, but I agree with you. The Wednesday, Friday phenomenon is not too different from the lifetime phenomenon. I always say that, we talk about life and death a lot. It's the life and death situation. It's not a good phrase. It's actually a birth and death situation. It's birth and death that are opposed, but if life actually has no opposite in our language. Life is just life. Death and birth are the endpoints that define a lifetime, a time segment within life.
Right. Life is the dash between the birth date and death date.
Yeah, well, I would say life contains the birth date and the death date. But yeah,
Right.
I've heard that phrase too.
Yeah. Someone was like, "Oh, on your tombstone, life is that dash that's between your birth and death dates."
The dash is the lifetime. A lifetime is the dash.
Yeah. So being a physician, being a doctor, and especially dealing with emergencies, how does, what you write about your book and what you believe in, and having that perspective, all the perspectives that you share in your book, how does that influence you or impact you, or how do you integrate that in your sort of day-to-day life when you are saving lives? And when sometimes I'm sure maybe you were in a situation where life couldn't be saved, and does that give you comfort? I'm kind of leading a question over here, but I just want to kind of see how that factors in your life, day-to-day work situation.
Yeah, I think for me, in terms of practical advantages, I mean, personally, just in terms of, feeling nice. Like, I'm not talking about a work in particular, but just like at home, or just, feeling nice, being able to enjoy things that can be enjoyed. If there are a lot of other things happening, it's hard to enjoy just like regular things. Like even this conversation, or before this, I shower is very enjoyable. Or, like, I think there's so many opportunities for enjoying life, right? I don't mean like great thrills or all that kind of stuff, unless you want to have those, and you can. But just the simple stuff of going about every day, I think that's greatest benefits of getting to know your mind and seeing what's going on. In terms of the emergency department, I think versatility of being able to relate to different kinds of people. Like you said, when it comes to sickness and people who may be dying, people relate to that very differently. Right. As you can imagine, some people are kind of okay with it. Some people are really not okay with it. Most people are not, obviously. And there's so many different things happening. And I guess like honoring that person's perspective, honoring where they're coming from, like being with them. Mm-hmm. I think that not having my own perspective on how it has to be. It's not that because I have a certain view that I think that everybody has to have this view. I mean, it's a view. Everybody has their view, right? So I think recognizing that all of these are views to begin with, and not that my view is right and then that some other person is, that gives you, I mean, there's so much freedom in that, because you can just be what you have to be in that moment. And the other thing is the power of silence, especially when dealing with things that are weighing on the mind. Sometimes, the right amount of silence can convey so much more than words or all of this other kind of frenetic kind of stuff. I mean, you still do what you have to do. I still practice emergency medicine. We do what we have to do. But what is the context in which we do that, right? Like, how do we see ourselves in the moment? How do we see our patients in that moment? What do we bring to that conversation? I think that versatility, the comfort with discomfort, the ability to do your best and work your best to do what you can do, and be there for everyone. Like all of those, like very simple, practical things. And then I also arrived to work on a broomstick with a hat. No, I'm kidding. I don't. Sometimes people ask me this question. They're like, "How does this translate into?" And I feel like it's very practical stuff, it's right. It's very practical stuff.
Well, one thing that resonates with me, what you said is having the sort of like respect and appreciation that people have those different views, or they cling to different sets in identity. And to me, what as you were saying this, what came to my mind was someone, I forget who it was, maybe it was Alan Watts, who was talking about something where if God is the dancer, you are the dance. And so if the manifestation of all of these people and existence and everything is just a dance, and again, this goes back to sort of like the analogy of the ocean and the ripples, right? So the surface is the ripple, and every ripple is different, and it's just kind of moving. But the common is the deep ocean, that underlayer. And these are just like different manifestations. And I have to believe that if you have that perspective, and you just see everybody else as just kind of another dance that's just kind of unfolding before you, and that it's going to fold back into this huge ocean of everythingness. And so even if those identities go away and come back and go away and come back, again, it's still that body of water, that huge mass of water, that ocean in which we are all but just those tiny little drops or ripples on the surface. And I think that just that perspective, if you have that kind of perspective, if you subscribe to that, I would imagine would have to calm you down, even in a stressful situation, because then you're not clinging to the identity, because then you believe that those identities will dissolve, that dance is going to end, and new dance is going to come in. And so I see that as a way of kind of calming, having different perspective, still doing what you're doing, still on a practical level, practicing, emergency medicine and saving those identities, one identity at a time. And but having that kind of space in which you can kind of see it, I think that would be very helpful and practical. So that's kind of, as you were describing it, that's how I was imagining you when you're working and doing medicine.
In emergency medicine, it's a good place to integrate this stuff, in the sense that when you're talking about birth and death situations, if a person's understanding isn't clear, or if that part isn't integrated, you can do some messed up stuff. If your ideas and your beliefs on what's happening, like, in the emergency department, I'm an emergency physician, and my responsibility is to take care of my patients, period, per my training, per what their wishes are, per the medical facilities available, etc. Not about imposing my ideas on somebody, etc. The real value here is, again, like I said, in that versatility, and
right.
Seeing that, being able to just shift lenses as needed. This person believes this. What kind of conversation is this going to be? Is this kind of like a joint exploration like you and I are having right now, or is this more like a fun? Is this person just, they want to talk about what they believe in, and it's almost like flipping the lens on the kaleidoscope. And you can have fun with any kind of conversation that's happening.
Right.
So I think that's very valuable, and you don't have to necessarily, like, you're not tied to anyone. You're not like, no, but this way true, I'm just playing this role. I mean, that kind of, that's painful. That's like you're kind of hiding yourself. You can actually appreciate, oh, this conversation is like this. It's like, oh, okay. And then, so every conversation, I think, has its own kind of cadence to it. And what are the beliefs that have to be fixed, that are used for this one? Okay. What are the beliefs that are here? Okay. And I think there's a lot of freedom in that.
So switching topics to sort of like the next section in your book. So you have you talk about identity and how we kind of cling to that, and you shine some perspective on that. So you are not who you think you are. And then your second chapter, or second part of the book, is the world is not what you think it is. And we kind of talked about that, space-time continuum and matter and things. Somewhere in between over there is the element of enlightenment. And you talk about enlightenment as well in the book. What is enlightenment to you? How do you define enlightenment? What is it? How can people attain it?
So I think I got asked this question recently on another in another conversation. What I told them is, the way I write it in the book is almost like a moving goalpost. Like I don't say like this exactly is enlightenment, nor do I say that having done this or having accomplished this, an individual person is enlightened. My view is that there's no individual person really that gets enlightened. It's naturally that sense of identity that was localized to a local personality, a local kind of body, that drops away. That the idea that this is what I am, that this feeling of I corresponds to just this particular kind of thing, that falls away. That is kind of seen through. And that is, I won't say that's what enlightenment is, but I would say to be the linchpin. Like I said, identity is at the core of all of these things. And that has to be the fundamental linchpin. There is kind of like before that and after that, in the sense that before that, the experience is of being localized within a body and of being contained within a body, right? And after that, right, it's that the body is within you. And then the mind and the thoughts, et cetera, are within you, right? It's not that it's inside the body, but that you-ness is not localized within that body anymore. So I would say, if there is something that we're going to define as enlightenment, which I wouldn't do, that has to be a linchpin of it. That shift in identity has to be a key part of it. The second thing is, if the identity is not in the body, right? And if what that I corresponds to is whatever it is that is appearing as this, then this whole idea of enlightenment kind of goes away. Because then, like, who is the enlightened one? and who's not the enlightened one, right? Like,
Right. It's still
we
tied
are
into some kind of
differentiated
identity.
aspects. Right. I mean, we're differentiated as of this, right? So which person is enlightened? It's not that any person is enlightened, right? I mean, that kind of seeing through some of that is part of this process too. Enlightenment is real, and it's like, it's, I want to be enlightened. That's really for the person that's really suffering, right? And it's helpful for that person because it is true that the breadcrumbs lead somewhere. That is true. And so the reality, the fixed hard reality of that notion is important, and there is a different experience. But the closer one gets to that experience, the more one dissolves. And so, and there's no way that that person can say that then that I am enlightened, because that the whole notion of the individual identity being enlightened is kind of seen through. That's part of the process, the disillusionment, so to speak, the
Right.
good kind of disillusionment. Yeah.
Maybe enlightenment shouldn't be a noun, it should be a verb as a process. It's a process of enlightening, in
Yeah.
which we kind of are on this kind of journey, and we discover these things and incorporate them and integrate them, instead of like, oh, I'm enlightened now I know everything,
Right.
and
From the individual perspective, there's always enlightening. There's this kind of process that's happening as the
Right.
mind gets subtler and subtler and rests more and more in whatever it is that it appears from, right? And whatever it is that appears to agitate as the mind and settle as the mind. So
Right.
as there's a processing like that from the perspective of the individual personality. However, from the perspective of consciousness, all this kind of stuff, or whatever it is, all this kind of stuff is a moot point, right? Consciousness doesn't about enlightenment. It doesn't care about, endarkenment or ignorance or whatever the other thing is. So recognizing this nature of this and this polarity is itself only there from the perspective of that mind, that to me is part of that enlightening understanding.
Right.
And then regarding to the light in the book, I also wrote about different facets of it. These were all the questions that I had. What is this light even? What is the nature of this light? Is there an actual light? There's the metaphorical light. There's the literal light. So all of these are also, again, I would say waypoints on the journey, aspects of what happens. But I don't think any of these, or at least for me, I would never say that any of these one things are enlightenment, because various things can happen at various points. Some can happen together. But it's real of these things integrating and settling, and that kind of thing is part of the process. There's no fixed point.
In the second part of your book, when you talk about the world, and you also tie it into consciousness as well, and you talk about some misconceptions about consciousness. What are some of the misconceptions of consciousness that people hold, that you found in your own research or in your own life?
So the first one is, first of all, we talked about the limitations of this word consciousness. So I just want to reference that quickly.
Yeah.
And then moving on now to what you just asked in terms of the misunderstandings, I think one of the biggest ones is that consciousness is something that is in my brain, or like sitting in my head somewhere, or created by my brain. The way they show it in cartoons, where it's like the cartoon character and there's this cloud here.
Right.
And it's like these small clouds of consciousness, and there's a thought there, and it might be a light bulb or an exclamation or a question mark, like but when they're going the cloud is up here with like a question mark.
Right.
Or sometimes it's in the brain. But of course, no anatomist has ever found consciousness, right, dissecting the brain, because we know that consciousness, at least some people would say, is not a physical thing. So this idea that consciousness is something that is localized, that is private to only me, that is only there when I'm awake, that it is created by the brain. These are some of the biggest misconceptions about consciousness. Now, these misconceptions are there because we experience this. I mean, it's, people aren't dumb. So people experience this, that it feels like consciousness is in my head, for example, or it feels like consciousness is definitely not in my knee. Consciousness is definitely not out there where the wall is, so to speak, right? People experience this. And what I would say is that what we're experiencing is a particular configuration of the mind. The mind can be configured in different ways. And if a person is experiencing that their consciousness is in their head, and it's localized and restricted there, and there's like a fence around it, and it's not outside that fence in some way, then understand that this is a configuration of the mind. I call this the first mind configuration. It's the mind that we're all given by society for the most part. And it's the idea that my mind is here, my consciousness is here, your consciousness is there, and there's nothing in between. It's like dead physical stuff in between. This is all because the mind has taken a particular configuration. And when that configuration changes, the experience of where consciousness is or what it is also changes.
So wouldn't that necessarily indicate that if the consciousness is outside of our bodies, outside of our brain, that when this body gets destroyed or killed or just dies of natural causes, the consciousness continues to exist?
Yeah, of course.
And so that's what people cling to in terms of like religious beliefs, right? This body dies and my spirit, right? That consciousness. But we think of consciousness as that, again, going back to that ego, that identity, right? It's like that me. Like there's going to be an Adrian out there. Like this body will die, but this Adrian is going to continue. Or, Anoop is going to be out there and maybe we're going to meet somewhere in the cloud, right? And but that's kind of like anthropomorphizing. I can never say that word. It's sort of like that experience of consciousness and limiting it too, right? Because then it's like, oh, do I have hands and do I have a head in there and arms and legs and all that? And so that's kind of like how we extrapolate from our own body existence.
Yeah.
But the consciousness is more than that. And tell me about how that relates to the next thing that you talk about in the book, which is the concept of non-duality. How can you talk about that a little bit and see if there's any connections between non-duality and consciousness?
Yeah. So non-duality is the English translation for Advaita. Advaita Vedanta is a particular formulation of Vedanta that specifically says that essentially the nature of things is consciousness, and there's nothing other than that. We experience other than that, of course. It's not denying that our experiences, but it's saying if we ultimately want to know, just like science says, okay, I want to know what this really is, then we say, okay, it's protons, neutrons, electrons. And say,
right.
No, I want to know what that really is. Okay, it's elementary particles. No, I want to know what that is. Okay, it's fields. So similarly, if we want to say, I want to know what the whole darn thing is, whether it's thoughts or memory or desire or a concrete slab or other planets or AI or NI, there's some word that we've coined, whatever it is, I want to know what this thing is. Says that, the nature of things is Advaita, meaning that the nature of things is essentially not multiplicity and not duality. It very particularly doesn't say that it's all one, right? That's a way that we translate it, and it kind of has some connotation to it, and it definitely seems more right than saying it's all separate and disconnected. It seems more right, but Advaita says we can't even say it's one because, as you said, once you get to one, you're talking about what is the first guy in the chain? What is the first thing in the chain? And you've already entered temporality, right? So this stays out of that. It says, you're not going to catch me there. I'm not saying it's all one. I'm saying it's Advaita. It's not two, meaning I can't say what it is. I can only tell you what it's not. It's not two, it's not many, and it's not one. And then, go figure it out kind of thing. So this is Advaita. This is non-duality. And again, it doesn't so much like consciousness, again, is our word for it. It talks more about Brahman, which is like the underlying nature of things. But it does say to get to that is through your mind, by recognizing the nature of your mind and then recognizing what the walls of the mind are, how the mind is divided, and what are the different parts of the mind. And then once you've really got the mind, once you've kind of integrated all the stuff around you, including the apparently internal world of thoughts, etc., then it's like, okay, got it all. Now it's not that, right? You've brought the whole universe into your focus, and you've kind of got it all. You've got it all in different places, and you kind of feel it internally, and then it says, not that. And then there has to be like a deep kind of rest, right? That the system goes into to kind of even let those kind of movements go, those subtle movements go. And then at that point, changes can happen in the body, changes happen in the mind, whatever it might happen. And that's this idea of what Advaita is really hinting at. That's when that starts to come through. So Advaita is really, it's a philosophical framework. Advaita Vedanta is a philosophical framework. The goal of it is not philosophy. Like the goal of Advaita, like if Advaita Vedanta could throw out all of philosophy, it would. It's concerned with only one thing, and that's knowing what the heck is going on. That's the way I see it. That's the way I've always felt about it. It's like, if you want to know what the heck is going on, I mean, if you really want to know, like if nothing else will do it for you, if nothing else quenches your thirst, then, Advaita will take you there, because it's even irreverent about itself. It doesn't even care about self. In the end, it says, toss all this crap. Toss even this, because this is not it, right? So that is Advaita Vedanta.
Is it because we just don't have the faculty, the facilities to describe it as, because it's beyond our description?
Right. Well, it can't be contained in a concept, right?
Right.
Obviously, a concept itself is a modification of our consciousness.
Right.
So, a droplet could never explain, as it were, the ocean in that sense, right? The concept can't really explain it, but by going to the essence of what is a concept essentially, then we know the essence of the whole thing. So it says, even discard these concepts, discard even these words that are trying to tell you what's real and what's not real. And, kind of like stand on your own 2 feet. Stand on your own 2 feet. Like, so it takes the student along that path.
What's interesting to me is when you have the concept of non-duality, which is almost like, again, I'm going to try to wrap it into words, but so this is going to be obviously imperfect, but it's like, it's the source. It's the source out of sort of the things that are dualities come out, because everything else in our reality is in a form of some kind of a duality. You have light, you have darkness, you have crest, and you have a trough. You have, you have life, you have death. You have one side of the coin, and you have the other side of the coin, and you need one in order for the other one to actually exist. Just in same as with like emotions. Without anger, you wouldn't have happiness, because you wouldn't know what happiness is. So it's interesting how out of this non-duality, something that cannot be described, comes this plethora of everythingness, which has that sense of duality, to them. And maybe that's how that relationship must exist.
Yes. Yeah, for any experience, you have to have some kind of duality. If you're going to experience something, even if it's something very subtle, like an intuition, there still has to be some subtle sense of identity that's recognizing some kind of intuition. That kind of duality has to be there. And Advaita just says that, recognize that what it is that is apparently, appearing as these dualities, duplicity, and all this kind of stuff.
Right. I'm going to hijack this into a different direction right now, because I want your opinion and thoughts on this. I was in Hayden's Planetarium in New York when I was a kid, and they were showing the known universe, and so they were kind of like zooming out from someone sitting on a beach, and then you got the sky, and you got the planet, and then you have our solar system, and then you have the galaxy, and then that's just one of many galaxies, and so on. And then I think then they reversed the whole process, and they went all the way into the brain, and here's your gray matter, and then you go in and you have you got neurons, synapses, and all these connections, and down to atoms and subatomical particles, and going into the micro and world and all that and beyond. And I couldn't, like, the connection that my brain made is that at the deepest level, sort of like looking at the brain and the connections of the brain, and then the highest level when they zoomed out, and this is the sort of like computer simulation, how the whole universe looks like, it looked like a cluster of neurons connected. And I made that sort of connection and I was like, wow, wouldn't it be really weird and bizarre and fun, maybe in a way, as a thought experiment, if the universe would be like a super brain, like a super brain, and all of its components, those galaxies and things that are connected, would be like sort of equivalent or analogous elements to like synapses in our brain. So sort of like this is the totality, the big brain, and then our tiny little brains, which kind of reflect the big one, are on this micro scale. And do you have any thoughts on that? Is that it would, I'm just curious. This is like just a broad question. What do you think of that?
Yeah.
Have you had similar realizations how things kind of fit in together?
Yeah. So if our hypothesis is true, if, let's say, consciousness is fundamental, right? If there's some broader field that we are calling consciousness, and if that's what's differentiating all this, then we should see its like recurrent patterns, right? Like its patterns, we should see them at different levels.
Right.
And so if this consciousness is of the nature of intelligence, what is the greatest symbol of intelligence to most people? It's the brain, right? The brain is a symbol of intelligence. It's kind of like
Right.
a manifestation, we might say, of intelligence. Then, the way that it looks, neurons, it wouldn't be surprising to see something that looks like that. That, in the vast universe, like if this is in fact a vast intelligence, that it has that it mirrors the brain, or the brain mirrors it, or that they reflect off each other, we would totally expect that. I mean, if you look at all organisms, if you look at the human structure, you have a central spinal cord and you have nerves going off to the side. It's the same thing for animals. It's the same thing for all plants, right? They have a central stem, and they have these branches or veins going off to both sides. So you have a similar anatomy for all of these
Right.
different kinds of living things. So it wouldn't be surprising at all.
So
Why
not totally
are
crazy.
all things? Yeah. Why are all things seem to be made of elementary particles? Why are alive things like humans and dead things like rocks are made of protons, neutrons, and electrons? Right? If they're so different, well, maybe there's a similar underlying thing. And I think physics knows that too. That's why they're looking for unified field or whatever it is that is underlying all of this kind of stuff.
All of this, yeah.
And I think if we look more carefully, we will see these kinds of patterns more and more all around us.
Right. Yeah. I mean, even if you look at what we would consider a inanimate object, something that we consider dead, a rock, and if you look at it on you dig deeper and deeper, and you see atoms, and they are in motion, they vibrate. You get Brown's motion, or Brownian motion, which is all these atoms. They vibrate, they move. You heat it up, they move faster. You cool it off, they move slower. So everything on a micro level or nano level or beyond, everything is moving. Everything is vibration. Everything is kind of resonating and well, not resonating, maybe resonating in some circumstances, but it's moving. It's in motion, constantly in motion. And sometimes that's what people kind of relate to. Like oh, I kind of resonate to that, or like I have this has a good vibe. So it's kind of, even in our language, there's these kind of inklings of insight into how are we connected to everything else and other people.
Yeah. And there's no such thing as inanimation. It's just in our mind we have this idea that some things don't move, but there's nothing that doesn't really move. Right. It just depends on how keen our perception is. Everything is in a state of movement, is processing, is in a state of flux, as you said. And I think people it's the same for us, right? We have thoughts, we have feelings, we have intuitions. We're always in a state of motion, just like we talked about before. Enlightening there's a state of motion to it, right? When we look at the differentiated aspect. And so I think that's exactly right. The more sensitive we are, the more we relate to those things, and the more we feel certain ways when we're in different places. Yeah.
So, there's just so much more to talk about, and we've been almost talking for, almost an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes. And I feel like there's just so much more to explore. So briefly, just to kind of wrap things up, what is next for you? You wrote this book, which is super interesting, and here it is for folks to take a peek at how the cover looks. Is this a dream? Check it out. Very, very interesting thoughts on reality, existence, the ego, your perceptions of things. Very illuminated, very well written. I love it. Now that you have this, what is next for you? Do you have ideas for like the next book? Is it going to be totally different, or is it going to be kind of extrapolating from this one, moving on to sort of to the next level, or is this like complete in a sense that you're happy with where it is and there is nothing left to explore in this realm at least?
The next one will probably come from some of these conversations I'm having, and depending on, where the conversations are going, probably from there might be something coming up. I also thought about writing on healthcare. I've written a few things on going back to the topic of healthcare, and specifically the things that are happening and what has to be done. If that'll get published, I don't know. It's kind of sitting there, and as thoughts come up, I might write them down. For now, it's really having these conversations around this book and seeing how are people receiving, what are they understanding about it, what's clear, what's not clear, and then we'll go from there.
I love it. I would like to invite you to a sequel to this because I do have more questions, and I really enjoyed this conversation. It's super eye-opening. You are not only a super intelligent dude, but also bring in a different set of perspectives and philosophy that is just I highly resonate to, and I would love to explore it more. And there's only so much that we can do in a limited amount of time, but. Let's do it again. Let's set up some time to talk a little bit more about it, and maybe we'll even tap into your first book because that is super interesting to me as well. So I'd love to talk about that as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, Anoop Kumar, book author of "Is This a Dream? Reflections on the Awakening Mind." Thank you for being on the show, and until next time, listen, learn, and share information with everybody else. The world is full of interesting people with wisdom and extraordinary experiences to learn from. Join me on a journey to discover them, speak with them, and learn from them. I'm Adrian Sinclair, host of A Podcast with Interesting People at apodcast.com.